then on behalf of the state.
Thank you, Your Honor. Please support Judge McIntosh, Mr. Thomas, Ms. Dixon. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the state in this case will prove to you, and will prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, our burden of proof, that back on January 28th of 2018, a little more than 2 years ago, that the defendant, sitting right there in the middle between Mr. Thomas and Ms. Dixon, raped, kidnapped, and murdered Rachael Anderson. January 28th was her birthday. She was 24 years old on the day she was murdered by this man. She moved here to Columbus because she's from Warren, Ohio. She moved here to Columbus as an intern at the Shaw Davis Funeral Home. She had gone to school in Cincinnati to get a mortuary education to work in a funeral home. And part of that process requires employment with a funeral home once you graduate from a college. And so she came here. She came here with a friend of hers, another student from that school in Cincinnati, Mr. Sean Griggs, and they jointly rented an apartment out at 3044 Allegheny, out in the east side here of Columbus, kind of in a pocket between Columbus and Whitehall. And both signed a lease, both were on the lease, and that will be important as we go through the testimony. He eventually moved out, and she lived there by herself as she was continuing to work there at the Shaw Davis Funeral Home. As I mentioned, she was from Warren, Ohio, and as her birthday, her 24th birthday, was approaching, plans were made to have a birthday party. And her brother, John, came in town for the birthday party, got here on Friday, the 26th of January. And Rachael had some friends here in Columbus, only friends in Columbus, that her best friend in high school, Haley Kennedy, his brother, John Kennedy, and his wife lived here in Columbus. And so when Rachael moved here, that was the only person besides people she later met at the Shaw Davis Funeral Home that she knew. And so they immediately got together. They had known each other for years. They had all gone to Warren G. Harding High School up in Warren, and so they were friends, and so they made plans to meet on Saturday night, which was the 27th, and have a birthday party for Rachael. Rachael worked that Saturday, and because her brother was here from out of town, apartment that she lived in worked by key. You had to have the key to lock it, whether you were coming or going. And so she gave her brother John that key while she went to work on Saturday, the idea that he would perhaps come and go, and he did. And so they went out that night. They met originally over at John and Tina Kennedy's apartment out by the casino on the west side here in Columbus. And as any birthday party may involve, they played music, they drank, and they smoked some weed, which was at the residence out on the west side. Some of them later went out to some other locations, clubs, and later returned to the residence out on the west side. They actually, John and the victim, Rachael, stayed out there that night and then went home out to 3044 Allegheny on Sunday morning. And John, her brother, made plans to go back to Warren. He left around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, forgot to give her her key back. So John is on his way back to Warren and let his sister know that, gee, the only key that Rachael had was with John on his way back to Warren. Luckily, Rachel had an extra key that Sean Griggs had when he lived there with her, which she had given to Tina and John Kennedy. And so she texted them about 1 in the afternoon, says, Brother John left with the key. Can I come out and pick up the extra key you have? And they texted back that one of the people who was here for the birthday party went to OU down in Athens, Ohio, and that John and Tina were going to give him a ride back to Athens. And so they texted her back and said, we're taking this fella who was here for the birthday party back to Athens. We won't be back here in Columbus till about 5:15. And so Rachel went about the rest of her day and then talked to her mother. Her mother, Trish, who lives in the Warren area, around 6:30 p.m. And shortly after that, texted the Kennedys and said, I'll be on my way soon to come out and pick up the key. And we know that Rachel talked to her mother about 6:30, and we know then that around 9:50 or so, Haley, the sister of John and Tina Kennedy, texted her a happy birthday message and tried to call her and didn't get an answer. We know from technology, and technology is a wonderful thing. Forensic evidence, technological advances are a wonderful thing because they allow law enforcement and us and you as jurors to see and hear things today in 2020 that perhaps we didn't have in the past. And so the police, the next day as they commenced their investigation, because Rachael Anderson was never seen or heard from again alive. Her friends, her family tried to contact her with no result. The next morning she was due at the Shaw Davis Funeral Home. She worked at the crematorium up in the Short North, around Buttles and High in that area. And her co-workers thought, gee, she's a very dependable, likable employee, and she's not here at work on Monday morning. I wonder what happened that she is not here. And so the manager sent out Trent Snyder, who was out doing some deliveries for the funeral home, said, hey, you've been to Rachel's apartment before. Why don't you stop by there and see if she overslept, find out where she was, because they knew it was her birthday and they thought maybe she did party too much and had slept in and didn't make it to work. So Trent Snyder, who will testify this morning, will tell you he went out, he knocked on the door, he'd been there before, he knew where she lived, and there was no answer. He went over to see the apartment manager, Lisa Richardson, for Cardinal Creek Crossing Apartments. That is a large unit cluster of apartments out there, and said, will you let me in the apartment to see where Rachael Anderson is? And not surprisingly, he said, well, who are you and why am I going to let you in somebody else's apartment? And so he, however, had noticed that in looking through a crease of the window that a candle was burning in the apartment. And that's a hazard if you're a landlord or if you're a tenant that's not home and forgot to blow out the candle. So Miss Richardson agreed to go over and inspect the apartment and see if Rachel was there. She had overslept. And so she went over and did a run through the apartment, came back out and said, I blew out the candle, but I didn't see Rachel. That was reported back. And that just wasn't a good enough answer for the people that knew Rachel. They said that this isn't like Rachel. Her car is there. Her car, however, was not parked where it usually is parked in front of her apartment. It's kind of around the corner in another slot. And Mr. Snyder was familiar with her car because it was a bit unusual. And so they said, well, this ain't right. The landlord said, well, I can't let you in, but Mr. Griggs is on the lease with her as a joint tenant. Let's try and call him, and if he consents, then we can have you and or others go in and look a little bit better. So they called the police. The police arrived. Again, the police didn't have a search warrant, didn't have evidence of a crime at that time. Certainly, you will see later, they had evidence of a horrific crime, a rape and a murder of Rachel, where she had been not only raped, but she had been hog-tied behind her back by a curling iron, a hairdryer, and her legs pulled up behind her and stuffed in a closet. She's stuffed in a closet, and that presumably is why Miss Richardson didn't see her when she inspected premises to see if she saw her. So we have Rachel not yet found. The police called, and they agreed to have Mr. Kennedy, who a flurry of phone calls with Mr. Griggs, with John Kennedy, who may have seen her somewhere after 6:30 when she had talked to her mother. She left to pick up the key. She went out. Mr. Kennedy would say she came out. Sometime Sunday evening, picked up the key, went back. Presumably, apartment had been unlocked this whole time while she was driving out to the west side because she couldn't lock it because it was a bolt lock. We know, however, that on the way back, she stopped at an Arby's, which is about 4 miles from her apartment there in Whitehall, and bought some Arby's food and an Arby's drink. We know that she made it home because that receipt says she was there at the Arby's about 7:30. So the evidence that we will be able to show, she talked to Mom at 6:30, said, I'm leaving shortly to pick up my key. Kennedy say he did. She did pick up the key. She stopped at Arby's around 7:30, and we know that the defendant's phone, and I mentioned technology, those of you who use Google, if you don't know where you're going and you use Google Maps, these are first position the person that owns and uses it. We will prove that the defendant's phone was at Rachel's apartment from 7:59 p.m. until about 9:25, roughly an hour and a half. We'll have an expert come in and explain to you what first, when you use a phone, it bounces off the nearest cell tower. We have cell towers all around the country. If I dialed right now on my phone, the nearest cell tower to this courthouse would show within a certain parameter that my phone was present and used at 10:13 a.m. And if needed, someone from the cell phone company or the police department who has records from the cell phone company could say that Ron O'Brien on 10:13 was in this general parameter of Mound and High, where this courthouse is located. So we will hear experts that will say Anthony Pardon's phone was in the area served by that cell tower that evening. But also, we have, as technology has advanced, Google has a location service on your phone. It's called geolocation, where if I have a Gmail address, which is run, owned, operated by Google, if I have a Gmail address such as TonyPardon52@gmail.com, Tony Pardon's phone becomes a tracking device. So we can track where Mr. Pardon is when he's carrying this phone. So guess what Google will tell us? And Detective James Howe is the expert for phone evidence for the police department. He will say that from 7:59 p.m. on Sunday, January 28th, the defendant's phone was at a certain number of meters from the apartment of Rachael Anderson. 7:59 p.m. to about 9:25, we, by scientific evidence, will put that man in her apartment. The precise time during which she is not seen or heard from, and stops answering her phone shortly after he left that apartment, and is never seen or heard from again until she is found the next day, bound and gagged, hog-tied, raped, and murdered. We will prove, as Ms. Roush and Ms. Van Koolen and I were talking about this case, we said, well, you know, what is the theme of this case? What does our evidence show? And our evidence will show, and I think it is an appropriate theme, that Anthony Pardon's phone was in all the wrong places at the wrong time. And guess what? Anthony Pardon's DNA was in all the wrong places. Vaginal swabs were taken at Rachael's autopsy. That's merely sticking in some evidentiary items into her vagina to swab and remove whatever may be found in there. And guess what? Inside the vagina of Rachael Anderson was that man's DNA. The DNA expert from the police crime lab will tell you that, and they gave us a report, and I want to quote it, but that on the vaginal swabs, the sperm fraction had the defendant's DNA. And there was also what they call epithelial DNA, which is skin cells. So skin cells are inside the wrong place for Rachael Anderson, and they belong to the defendant. Not only that, I mentioned she was bound and gagged and hogtied. She was hogtied with the curling iron from her bathroom. She was hogtied behind her back with a hairdryer. And the police also took swabs from that hairdryer and that curling iron. And the swabs are as merely taking a Q-tip and rubbing it on the cable, the wire that you plug in the wall for the curling iron and the hairdryer. And guess whose DNA is on that cable from the curling iron and the hairdryer? Anthony Pardon's. Once again, Anthony Pardon's DNA is in the wrong place. Because this woman, when she was hogtied, and you will see her ankles, and I'll warn you now, in a few minutes I'm going to show you some of the evidence we will present in our case, which will include the picture of her hogtied as they found her in that closet, behind her back. And you will see behind her back and around her ankles that cord, around which the DNA of the defendant is found. Nobody else's DNA is in her vagina. Nobody else's DNA besides him can be identified on what was used to bound her. There was a shroud kind of thing put over her head as she's hogtied in the closet. Across the top of the door of the closet and around the doorknob of the closet is wrapped these cables so that she can be asphyxiated around the neck by these cords, as the coroner will tell you. Not only that, she is stabbed the base of her skull right back here by what is later recovered, a steak knife. She had a set of steak knives in her kitchen, and one was recovered with blood and hair on it. And you'll see the pictures of those wounds. And once again, using Mr. Pardon's phone, guess what? Her purse is dumped upside down on the floor in her living room. It appears there's a struggle upstairs. There is male DNA found under her fingernails. They do fingernail scrapings and can determine it's male DNA, but there's not a sufficient quantity to test it. The police, as they are called to the scene that morning, John Kennedy goes in and more closely inspects the premises and finds her body in the closet. And the police are called, and thereafter the crime scene search unit arrives. BCI is called. They process the scene by taking hundreds of photographs that you'll see. They don't know who may have committed this crime. They say, well, what was taken? Well, there was a orange credit card belonging to Rachel that was taken. And I want to get this time right, at 9:49 p.m., the defendant's phone is in the apartment from 7:59 to 9:25. At 9:49 p.m., and between 9:49 and 11:09, and those are precise numbers because when you go with a credit card to an ATM machine and try and take out money, that logs it. And so Rachel's credit card is attempted to be used at 7 different locations, not far from her apartment, and frankly not far from where the defendant was living at the time. And some video stills are taken from the attempted use of the credit card. And a man by the name of Anthony Sleets panhandles outside of one of these locations. And Mr. Sleets is identified in one of these surveillance photos within an hour after the defendant left the apartment building. And over a period of several days, that credit card was used or attempted to be used 15 different times at different locations across the city. And the defendant's phone or his sister were using that credit card or attempting to use that credit card. Well, since Mr. Anthony Sleets is identified, he contacted by the police and detained and interviewed and gave a full interview to the police at the time, but has since passed away. So you won't hear him from the witness stand, but an interview with the police was done where a videoed interview will play for you. And he'll say he was panhandling, and some fella he didn't know came up and asked him, would you use this credit card to take some money out? Here is the PIN number. And that this man said that he and his girlfriend had a beef and he was afraid she was going to drain the account and he didn't want to use it himself, but I'll give you some money if you use it. So we have Anthony Sleets in some video surveillance at some of these premises using the credit card. So the police said, well, what should we do next? Well, they worked on the case, but they had those vaginal swabs. And they took the vaginal swabs and were able to identify them and said, the semen of someone by the name of Anthony Pardon is in the vagina and on the inner thigh and in the cervical area of Rachael Anderson. And on her right wrist is DNA of a man named Anthony Pardon. Presumably, whoever bound her in this terrible way grabbed her wrist in order to get it behind her back as he did it. So, again, the DNA of the defendant is in all the wrong places. Around her wrist, on her inner thigh, her cervical region, in her vagina, and his phone is at these different locations where her stolen credit card is being used. So the police say, let's see if we can find Anthony Pardon, and thereafter seek subpoenas and get subpoenas for those credit card records, for the phone records, for the Google geolocation services. And so we have three different things. The cell tower location, putting his cell phone in that region of her apartment. The geolocation services that put her, I think they will testify, within 25 meters of the apartment between 7:59 and 9:25. And the card continues to be used several days later. As I say, one of the locations was the DSW store at Easton and a place known as City Trends. And Deborah Pardon, who will testify, she will say, I took the credit card, I used the credit card, my brother was the source of the credit card, my brother gave me the PIN that I used to make purchases, to try and get money from ATMs, machines. But you will be able to see in two of those surveillance photos the sister there at the counter engaging in the transaction, but right behind her you can see a man who is Anthony Pardon. He's with his sister while she's using the credit card of the murdered Rachael Anderson. He's wearing a black and red New York ball cap in that video surveillance that you can see. And he's wearing a black or dark jacket, has a little circle on the side and something on its breast. And guess what? When he is arrested in the back seat of the car that he had been driving is a black and red New York ball cap that I'm going to show you in just a minute. And the next day, because he had been stopped by a highway patrolman the day before, driving a car, he didn't have a driver's license. He decided, I need to get a driver's license. Went down just a couple blocks down the street to the office of a state representative and went to her office to see if she could facilitate him getting a driver's license. Now, why he just didn't go to the BMV like you and me do, I'm not sure we have an explanation for. But walking off the elevator in the 16th floor of the Rife Tower, 3 blocks just north of this courthouse, we have a video surveillance, as they run a constant video surveillance in that premises, them getting off the elevator, and you can see that patch on the coat he's wearing and on the shoulder and on the chest that he was wearing up at the DSW when he was with his sister using Rachael Anderson's credit card. And ladies and gentlemen, this case, like many others, is putting together the pieces of a puzzle. And the puzzle is, poor Rachael had a birthday party. Her brother took the key. There's no signs of forced entry in Rachel's apartment, and I'm not sure we can say whether or not the defendant went in the apartment while she was picking up the key, or whether he knocked on the door and she opened it up and he pushed his way in. But the defendant was in her apartment the night she was murdered. The defendant's DNA is in all the wrong places, and his phone is in all the wrong places. And through that scientific forensic evidence, we're going to be able to show to you that on the night of the murder, the defendant's phone, at least, was in the apartment from about 7:59 to 9:25. that only about 20 minutes later, several blocks away on Main Street, there's video surveillance photos of Mr. Sleets using the card, and guess what? The defendant's phone is also there at that location, confirming what the deceased Mr. Sleets had said, that some fella he didn't know approached him and asked him to do that. We'll call about 14 witnesses, some of them expert witnesses from BCI, some of them expert witness on phones from CPD or the Columbus Police Department. And as the judge read to you the indictment, there are multiple counts of murder with one victim that the state's entitled to charge. First, that the defendant purposely and with prior calculation and design took a while to murder Rachael Anderson. As she was being bound and gagged, there was a black piece of cloth jammed down her throat. Some of the cords from the Venetian blinds had been used to wrap around her neck and around her back. There was a white belt that was used to bind her. And as I said, the coroner will testify the cause of death was asphyxiation around the neck, and she had been so strongly strangled, asphyxiated, that the blood vessels in her eyes were ruptured. And that's a sign of applied pressure around the neck that you'll see from these items that I just described. And at this point, what I would like to do is show that some of the evidence that we have that you will see, and if this device is going to work right, as we have found previously, in this case it always isn't the case, but there you will see recovered at the scene a driver's license of Rachael showing her birthday, the day she was murdered, of January 28, 1996, turning 24. And that is marked as an exhibit in this case. It was found amidst the mess, the Arby's food on the floor of her apartment on Allegheny. The next photograph shows her laying in the closet with that white shroud around her head, covered by blood. You can see the white belt coming down from being draped over the top of that closet, which then gagged and strangled her. There's another view of how she was found in the closet by John Kennedy the next day. He will describe finding it. The next exhibit that the state will present will show once she had been pulled out of the closet a little bit from a different angle. There you can see her feet hogtied. You can see the cords upon which that man's DNA was found. You can see the wrist, right wrist behind her back where his DNA was found as she is hogtied in that position. There are the cords, and you can see how she was tied up. There they are, staged by the police at the scene. The detective will describe that it's an evidence item marked by them as number 29. It was swabbed, sent to the crime lab, and they will testify about the DNA that's found on there. The defendant's DNA, again in the wrong place. And here we have the power of technology here that will show you visually on this exhibit that at 9:49 p.m., and there you can see Mr. Anthony Sleets going into the premises. And again, 9:51, you have nearby the BP, 9:56, 9:57, 10 p.m., U.S. Bank in Bexley, 10:06, 10:09, 10:09, 10:11, 10:11, nearby Huntington Bank, 10:15, 10:16, the R&M carryout, 10:21 to 10:24 again. You can see Mr. Sleets. You have a Kroger, nearby Kroger, 10:35 to 10:51, and finally a Speedy Mart, 11:09. And if that all adds up, as I told you earlier, 15 times shortly after her murder, we have that item being used. Her credit card, her stolen credit card, that Anthony Sleets. We have the next day, similar use of the credit card. Kroger, the Hollywood Casino, Fine Fair Food Market, ExxonMobil, City Trends. There's the DSW Easton entrance. Here you can see where the defendant was living at the time and where Rachel's residence was. So for 3 days before the credit card was cut off, the defendant or his sister or Mr. Sleets, and the defendant with Mr. Sleets, using the stolen credit card belonging to the then murdered Rachael Anderson. There are two other locations, or one other location, the Fine Fair Food Market, January 30th. Remember, she's murdered on the evening of January 28th. You can see its proximity on Cleveland Avenue to where the defendant was living at that time. Finally, we have on February 1st, the pick and go on Main Street. Man going in, you can't see his face. Man going in appears to be wearing the kind of clothing that we see Mr. Pardon wearing at the DSW and in the photograph at the Rife Tower several blocks down the street. Here is a video surveillance photo of the defendant's sister who will testify at the DSW, and you can see that, or may not be able to see it that well from that distance, the man behind her in the red and black hat said New York, New York, that was found in the trunk of his car, or the car he was driving, standing right behind. There's another angle with him standing there. And there he is at the Rife Tower wearing that coat with that thing here. And there is that New York, New York hat in the vehicle he was driving. And here we have what the experts will testify to is a historical cell site analysis report. That sounds fancy, but down in the right-hand corner is the rental office of Cardinal Crossing Apartments, and in the top you see Rachel's apartment, and the expert will tell you that there are multiple geolocation hits. That means his phone is in that area, and he'll describe the distance of those circles between 7:59 p.m. and 9:25. And you'll hear all that testimony here in this courtroom in the next week, ladies and gentlemen. And the state will expect to submit to you in closing argument, after you hear all this evidence, that we have proven beyond a reasonable doubt that back on January 28th, on her birthday, the defendant kidnapped, and as Ms. Rauch talked about the law being different than what we may not perceive it to be, there wasn't a kidnapping from point A to point B, but from where she was in her apartment up to the upper level and into a closet, bound and gagged. And that would constitute the kidnapping that the state is submitting occurred. The murder was done in the course of or part of the kidnapping, facilitating it. The other aggravated murder counts are aggravated murder, purposely causing the defendant's death during the course of a rape, a robbery, aggravated robbery, a murder that happened during the course of or fleeing afterwards. The credit card is removed from the premises. That's a theft offense. It's used to take money from her account, used to buy goods. That's aggravated robbery under the definition Judge McIntosh will give you at the close of the case. And aggravated burglary means trespassing in someone's premises without their permission by force, stealth, or deception. And again, aggravated murder in the course of or part of the burglary is the remaining aggravated murder count, and there are separate counts for those different crimes of kidnapping, aggravated burglary, aggravated robbery, and rape. And at the close of all that evidence, and when Judge McIntosh gives you instructions of law, the state will stand before you and submit, and we have proven beyond a reasonable doubt that back on her birthday, Rachael Anderson was brutally, terribly tortured, raped, and murdered by the defendant, sitting right there. And we would expect at that point in time to ask you to return a finding of guilty on all counts and all specifications. And thank you for your attention, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien.